So now if we look at some examples of this experimental data, we can get some indication of how useful this data is. If we look at a 20-year annual series of population flows between the Sydney Statistical Division and Tasmania, for example, we can get a real good sense of how the flows vary between these two regions throughout these 20 interesting years. This gives us a much more complete picture than what the 5-yearly census migration snapshots provide. And so what this annual data shows is that there were some very distinct periods of flows from Sydney to Tasmania over these 20 years, with very little variation happening in the opposite direction. The peaks in these Sydney to Tasmania flows coinciding with some large overseas arrivals into New South Wales in the late 1980s, and some major surges in Sydney house prices in the late 80s, and also from around 2003 to 2005. To highlight how we can leverage off the regional attributes of the converted Medicare data, I'll next focus on a statistical region of Melbourne, which has seen a net figure of around 1 million people move out since the mid-1980s. Not surprisingly, this data shows that most movers out of inner eastern Melbourne move to other parts of Melbourne. With about 20,000 people moving across town to the northwestern Melbourne statistical region, around 30,000 moving to the rapidly growing outer western Melbourne, just over 100,000 people moved to each of the adjoining regions of inner and southern Melbourne, while the most popular destination of inner eastern Melbourne outmigrants was to outer eastern Melbourne. Over this time, a significant number of inner eastern Melbourne residents moved to Sydney, and even more went to southeast Queensland. From 1986 to 2006, Brisbane attracted 21,000 former inner eastern Melbourne residents, Gold Coast took in 12,000, and around 5,000 moved to the Sunshine Coast. The annual data shows that a lot of these moves occurred out of inner eastern Melbourne throughout Victoria's economically stagnant years of 1992 to 1994. Moving now to a regional local government area, we can now show how this annual migration data helps provide a better demographic impact of localised events such as employment centre closures. And here we'll consider the case of Inverell in northern New South Wales. If we investigate the annual net migration flow for Inverell over the 20 years up until 2006, we can see two distinct periods of large net outflows, coinciding with the closure of significant alluvial sapphire mines in the Inverell area during these two periods. If we hone in on these 2-3 year periods, we can check out whether migration patterns were different over these two periods in terms of where these people were moving to. In the first major outflow period, the largest numbers were moving to the surrounding or nearby LGAs of Tamworth, then Brisbane, then Coffs Harbour, Moree Plains, and Armidale Council areas. The Medicare-based data shows then that for the second large outflow phase, destinations were different, with Moree Plains, Brisbane and Armidale now the most popular destinations, followed by Tamworth and then Coffs Harbour. This 20-year internal migration series also allows us to gain further insight into why populations are growing or declining over this time, in terms of the relative share of the population change being attributable to natural increase, internal migration and overseas migration. In the case of Mandurah in Western Australia, whose population increased by a massive 40,000 people between 1986 and 2006, this data lets us see now that by far the largest component of population change over this period was the internal migration component, shown by the orange stack or the middle stack. The Mandurah experience is different to another rapidly growing LGA in South Australia, the southern Adelaide region of Onkaparinga owing much more of its 20-year population growth to natural increase. The bottom or cream stack showing natural increase is higher than the share of population change due to internal migration. Whereas in the central New South Wales Council area of Dubbo, the data shows that virtually none of Dubbo's population change in the 20 years to 2006 was due to internal migration. In fact, the Medicare-based internal migration data here nets out to almost zero over these 20 years, with the bulk of the 8,000 increase in population over this time being due to natural increase, the cream or bottom stack. This implies that the remainder of the growth for Dubbo between 1986 and 2006 was due to net overseas migration. Migration provides a fundamental indicator of social, economic and environmental issues and trends at regional level. And with the recent focus on regionalism by the Commonwealth Government, including a push for more indicators at a regional level, now does appear to be an appropriate time to develop an experimental series of regional migration estimates. A regular and up-to-date regional migration series would also provide a much more reliable platform to base regional level population projections from. Good regional population projections are vital for planning for the future. The ABS will continue to work on developing this series of regional migration estimates, and over 2011 will release an information paper and provide further updates as the project progresses.